She curtsied to the wrong man. The real Duke watched from the shadows and said nothing. The candles in the Marchioness of Hartwell's ballroom numbered in the thousands, or so it seemed to Arabella Fairfax as she stood at the entrance and tried not to squint against the blaze. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls from the vaulted ceiling, each one dripping with enough wax-bright flames to illuminate a small village. The effect was magnificent and entirely overwhelming, rather like being asked to admire a bonfire while standing inside it. "Stop gawking," her aunt hissed, fingers tightening on Arabella's elbow with the precision of a woman who had spent 40 years navigating ballrooms and considered herself an expert in the art of not appearing impressed. "You look like a milkmaid at her first fair." "I was merely counting the chandeliers, Aunt Whitmore. I believe there are 7, though the one nearest the orchestra appears to be listing slightly to the left. Do you suppose anyone has noticed? It seems the sort of thing that might cause concern if it—" "Arabella." Her aunt's voice carried the particular weariness of someone who had heard quite enough observations for one evening, and the evening had barely begun. "What did we discuss in the carriage?" Arabella swallowed the rest of her commentary about the chandelier, which she had genuinely found interesting, and reminded herself of the rules. Shorter answers, fewer opinions, more demure smiles. She was not here to be interesting. She was here to be marriageable. And apparently those two qualities existed in inverse proportion to one another. "Shorter answers," she recited dutifully, "fewer opinions, more demure smiles. And under no circumstances am I to mention that I have read Wollstonecraft. Under no circumstances are you to mention that you can read at all, if you can possibly help it. Gentlemen do not want wives who read. They want wives who listen, who agree, who make them feel clever." Lady Whitmore surveyed the ballroom with the calculating eye of a general assessing a battlefield. "Now, smile as though you haven't a thought in your head, and follow me." Arabella arranged her features into what she hoped resembled vacant pleasantness, and allowed herself to be led into the crush of bodies, silk, and suffocating perfume that constituted the height of the London season. Around her, the cream of society swirled in elaborate patterns, ladies in gowns that cost more than her father's annual income, gentlemen in tailcoats so precisely fitted they might have been sewn directly onto their bodies, everyone performing the intricate dance of status and ambition that passed for polite entertainment among the aristocracy. She had done this before, of course. 2 seasons prior, in fact, each one ending in the particular failure that came from being too opinionated, too quick-tongued, too much of everything that gentlemen apparently did not want. The first season, she had made the mistake of correcting a viscount's Latin during a dinner party. The second, she had laughed, actually laughed, with her head thrown back and her teeth showing at a joke told by a baron's younger son, who had immediately decided that any woman who laughed like that must be laughing at him, and had spread unkind rumours about her character. This was her third and final attempt. Her father's letter had made that abundantly clear, the words still burning in her memory like a brand. "The funds for another season do not exist, Arabella. You must marry, or you must find employment. There is no third option." Employment meant governessing, which meant spending the rest of her life caring for other women's children while pretending not to have opinions about anything. It meant invisibility, irrelevance, a slow fade into the wallpaper of someone else's household. It meant admitting, once and for all, that she was too much for anyone to want. Marriage meant, well, marriage meant performing a version of herself that felt like wearing someone else's skin. But at least it would be her own household, her own children, her own wallpaper to fade into. She was trying very hard not to think about whether either option contained any possibility of happiness. "There!" Lady Whitmore's grip tightened with sudden excitement. "Do you see him? By the pillars on the eastern wall." Arabella followed her aunt's gaze across the ballroom, navigating past dancing couples and clutches of gossiping matrons until she found the pillars in question. A man stood there, tall and golden-haired, with the sort of classically handsome features that painters favoured for portraits of Greek heroes. He was surrounded by admirers, young ladies with their mammas hovering nearby, gentlemen seeking his favour, everyone orbiting him like planets around a particularly well-dressed sun. "The Duke of Thornwood," Lady Whitmore breathed, and her voice carried the reverent hush usually reserved for religious experiences or very good jewellery. "They say he is finally ready to choose a bride. 20,000 a year, estates in 4 counties, and not a breath of scandal attached to his name. He is the greatest catch in England, and he is here, tonight, in this very room." Arabella studied the golden-haired man, and felt nothing in particular. He was handsome, certainly, in the way that statues were handsome, pleasant to look at, but not especially stirring. Still, 20,000 a year would solve rather a lot of problems, and estates in 4 counties suggested the sort of husband who might spend most of his time elsewhere, leaving her free to read Wollstonecraft in peace. "He looks rather surrounded," she observed. "I doubt he has any interest in meeting yet another hopeful debutante." "Nonsense. You are the granddaughter of an earl, however reduced our circumstances may have become. Your breeding is impeccable, even if your fortune is not." Lady Whitmore was already calculating angles of approach, her eyes darting between the Duke and the various obstacles between them. "Besides, you have something those other girls lack. An unfortunate tendency to speak my mind. Copper hair." Her aunt said this as though it were a tremendous asset, rather than the source of endless maternal despair throughout Arabella's childhood. "It is distinctive, memorable. In a sea of blonde and brunette, you will stand out, like a beacon warning ships away from rocky shores." "Like a flame," Lady Whitmore corrected firmly, "drawing moths to its warmth. Now, I am going to maneuver us closer. When the crowd around him thins, and it will thin, these things always ebb and flow, you will approach Curtsey and introduce yourself with precisely the amount of demure charm we practiced. Remember, shorter answers, fewer opinions, and for heaven's sake do not mention books of any kind. What if he asks what I enjoy reading? Tell him you find reading rather fatiguing and prefer to occupy yourself with needlework and watercolours. But I despise needlework. My watercolours look like someone has sneezed pigment onto canvas. He does not need to know that until after the wedding." Lady Whitmore began steering them through the crowd with the determination of a ship's captain navigating particularly treacherous waters. "Once you are a duchess, you may read whatever you like and paint as hideously as you please. Until then, you are a demure, agreeable, charmingly empty-headed young lady who wants nothing more than to make some fortunate gentleman very happy. Understood?" Arabella understood. She simply wasn't certain she could do it convincingly enough to fool anyone, let alone a duke who presumably had his choice of genuinely demure young ladies who actually enjoyed needlework. They positioned themselves near enough to observe the duke's orbit, but not so close as to appear desperate. Arabella used the waiting time to study the ballroom's other occupants, a habit she could not seem to break despite its social uselessness. There was Lady Hartwell herself, resplendent in violet silk, holding court near the refreshment tables with the satisfied air of a woman whose ball was an unqualified success. There was a cluster of young debutantes by the windows, nervously comparing dance cards and pretending not to notice the gentleman who passed without asking them to dance. There was a girl, very young, standing alone by a potted fern, with the look of someone who wished the fern were large enough to hide behind completely. Arabella's heart clenched with recognition. She remembered that feeling, that desperate invisibility, that certainty that everyone was staring even as everyone ignored you. The girl could not have been more than 17, with mouse-brown hair and a gown that was clearly a hand-me-down, altered to fit, but not altered quite well enough. Her eyes were too bright, the particular brightness that preceded tears. "Aunt Whitmore, I need to visit the retiring room." "Now? The crowd around the Duke is beginning to thin. This is precisely the wrong moment to—" "It is rather urgent, I'm afraid." Arabella was already extracting herself from her aunt's grip. "I shall return shortly. Please save my place in whatever queue is forming for ducal attention." She didn't wait for permission, a habit that had caused no end of trouble throughout her life, but that she could not seem to abandon. Instead, she slipped through the crowd toward the fern and the frightened girl beside it, moving with the purposeful stride of someone who knew exactly where she was going, even when she didn't. "Forgive me," she said quietly, positioning herself so that her skirts blocked the girl from the room's view. "But you look as though you might welcome a moment of invisibility." The girl startled, then stared at her with wide, wet eyes. I beg your pardon? I am Arabella Fairfax, and I have been where you are standing more times than I care to count. Shall we pretend to be having a delightful conversation while you compose yourself? I find that looking as though one is engaged in pleasant socialization tends to discourage unwanted attention." The girl swallowed hard, visibly fighting for control. "I tore my hem, dancing. I stepped on it during the country dance, and I felt it rip. And I don't know how to. My mother will be so disappointed." "Ah." Arabella smiled with genuine warmth. "A torn hem. Is that all? I thought perhaps you had accidentally insulted a dowager, or spilled punch on an earl. A torn hem is nothing. I once ripped my entire flounce clean off during a quadrille, and had to finish the dance holding it in place with my free hand while pretending nothing was amiss." The girl's lips twitched despite her distress. "Truly?" "Truly. I told my partner I was practicing a new continental fashion that simply hadn't reached London yet. He believed me completely, which tells you rather a lot about the intelligence of the average gentleman at these affairs." She glanced down at the girl's hem, assessing the damage. "Now, this is easily managed. Have you a pin? No? I have 3 in my reticule. One learns to prepare for such emergencies. Come with me to the retiring room, and we shall have you mended in no time." "But your aunt? I saw you with her. You were going somewhere." "My aunt can wait. Dukes can wait. Hems cannot." Arabella offered her arm with a conspiratorial smile. "Besides, I find the retiring room far more interesting than ballrooms. That is where the real conversations happen, away from the men who think we have nothing to say worth hearing." She led the girl, Miss Ellen Ashby, she learned, daughter of a minor baronet, attending her very first ball through the crowd to the retiring room, where she made good on her promise. The hem was mended with quick, practical stitches that would hold through any number of country dances. Ellen's tears were dried, her composure restored, her gratitude so earnest that Arabella felt almost guilty for accepting it. "I don't know how to thank you," Ellen said, examining her repaired hem with wondering eyes. "You saved me from complete humiliation, and we had never even met." "Consider it a welcome to the peculiar sisterhood of ballroom survival," Arabella replied. "We must look out for one another, those of us who find these affairs more terrifying than enjoyable. Now go find your mother and have a wonderful evening, and if anyone asks about your hem, tell them it is a new continental fashion. It worked for me." Ellen laughed a real laugh, bright and young and hopeful, and departed with her confidence restored. Arabella remained a moment longer, staring at her reflection in the retiring room mirror and trying to recognize the woman looking back at her. "That," she thought, "that is who you are. The one who helps frightened girls with torn hems. The one who makes jokes about continental fashions to ease someone else's embarrassment. The one who would rather fix a stranger's problem than pursue a duke. But that version of herself would not pay her father's debts or save her sister from an unwanted marriage or keep her from a lifetime of governessing. That version was a luxury she could not afford. She took a breath, squared her shoulders, and went back to being the demure, agreeable, charmingly empty-headed young lady her aunt required. Lady Whitmore was waiting with barely concealed impatience. "Where have you been? I thought you said the retiring room, but you were gone nearly 20 minutes, and the Duke has moved twice, and I have had to reposition our approach entirely. I apologize, Aunt. There was a situation requiring attention." "What sort of situation?" "Never mind. I don't want to know. The important thing is that you are here now, and look there, by the French doors. He has separated from the main crowd. He is walking toward the garden entrance. This is your opportunity." Arabella looked where her aunt indicated, and saw the golden-haired man from earlier, now alone, making his way toward the doors that led to the torchlit garden beyond. He moved with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being admired, pausing briefly to accept a glass of champagne from a passing footman. "Go," Lady Whitmore urged, giving her a small push. "Intercept him before he reaches the garden. Curtsy, introduce yourself. Be charming. Remember everything we practiced." "But what do I say?" "It doesn't matter what you say, only how you say it. Smile, defer to his opinions, make him feel as though he is the most fascinating man you have ever encountered. That is all any of them want, truly." Arabella's feet were moving before she had consciously decided to obey. The crowd parted around her, or perhaps she parted around it, and then she was approaching the golden-haired man, her heart hammering against her ribs, her carefully rehearsed words evaporating from her memory like morning mist. He turned as she reached him, his handsome face arranging itself into an expression of pleasant inquiry. Up close, he was even more striking: blue eyes, perfectly symmetrical features, the kind of bone structure that portrait painters must dream about. He smiled, and his teeth were very white and very even. "Your Grace." Arabella sank into her most elegant curtsy, the one she had practiced in front of mirrors until her knees ached. "Forgive my forwardness in approaching without introduction, but I could not let the evening pass without expressing what an honor it is to make your acquaintance. I am Miss Arabella Fairfax, and I have heard so much about your Grace's many accomplishments." She rose from the curtsy to find him watching her with an expression she could not quite read. Surprised, perhaps, but also something else. Something that flickered behind his eyes too quickly for her to name. "Miss Fairfax," he repeated, and his voice was honey-smooth, cultured, charming. "What a pleasure. I confess I was not expecting such a delightful interruption to my evening." "I hope I am not intruding upon your Grace's solitude. I saw you walking toward the garden and thought that is—" "I hoped." She was babbling. Shorter answers, fewer opinions. She forced herself to stop talking and simply smile. "Not at all." He took her hand. She had not offered it, she realized belatedly, but he had taken it anyway and raised it almost to his lips before releasing it. "In truth, I was finding the ballroom rather stifling. Too many eyes, too many expectations. I thought a breath of garden air might provide some relief." "The gardens are said to be magnificent," Arabella offered. "Lady Hartwell is renowned for her roses." "Is she? Then perhaps you would do me the honor of viewing them with me. I find gardens are always improved by pleasant company, and I suspect your company would be very pleasant indeed." Something about the invitation made Arabella's stomach tighten with unease, though she could not identify its source. This was what she wanted, wasn't it? The Duke's attention, a private moment to make an impression, exactly the opportunity her aunt had been engineering all evening. Yes, Your Grace, that would be lovely." He offered his arm with practiced elegance. "Please, call me Sebastian. I grow so weary of titles and formality. When one is forever Your Grace this and Your Grace that, one begins to feel less like a person and more like a position." "Sebastian," she repeated, and the name felt strange on her tongue, too intimate for so brief an acquaintance. But perhaps dukes operated by different rules. Perhaps this was simply how they conducted themselves, with easy familiarity that ordinary people would consider forward. They walked together through the French doors and into the garden beyond. Torches lined the paths, casting pools of golden light between stretches of shadow. The air was cool after the ballroom's oppressive heat, scented with night-blooming jasmine and the green freshness of growing things. Other couples strolled the paths as well, providing the technical satisfaction of propriety, even as the torchlight gave everything an atmosphere of forbidden romance. "Tell me about yourself, Miss Fairfax." Sebastian the Duke guided her along a winding path, his hand warm and firm on her arm. "I find I am curious about you. A woman who approaches a duke without introduction suggests either remarkable confidence or remarkable desperation, and I cannot quite determine which applies in your case." The observation was accurate enough to sting. "Perhaps a bit of both, Your Grace. Sebastian," she corrected when he made a small sound of protest. "I am not in the habit of approaching strangers at balls, but my aunt was most insistent that the opportunity not be wasted." "Ah, aunts, the great strategists of the marriage market. And what did your aunt tell you about me, I wonder?" "That you are the greatest catch in England," Arabella admitted, deciding that honesty might distinguish her from the presumably endless parade of young ladies who had said the same thing less directly. 20,000 a year, estates in 4 counties, mysteriously unmarried despite being terribly eligible. She also mentioned that you are expected to finally choose a bride this season, which explains why the ballroom was quite so crowded with hopeful debutantes. He laughed, a sound that should have been pleasant but somehow wasn't. Quite. How refreshingly direct. Most young ladies pretend they have no idea who I am or why I might be considered desirable. They simper and demur and act as though my title and fortune are mere incidentals rather than the entire reason they are speaking to me. "I considered simpering," Arabella said, "but I was never very good at it. My face tends to do what it wants rather than what I tell it." I noticed. His eyes moved over her face with an assessing quality she could not quite name. "Your face is very expressive. It makes you easy to read. My aunt considers that a significant flaw. And you? What do you consider it?" The question surprised her. No one had ever asked what she thought about her own flaws. They simply catalogued them and moved on. I suppose I consider it honest. I have never been skilled at hiding my reactions, which has caused no end of trouble in polite society. But it also means that when I like something, or someone, there is no doubt about the sincerity of my feeling." Sincerity. He said the word as though tasting it. How rare, and how valuable. They had wandered deeper into the garden, she realized, away from the other couples and the torchlight. The path here was darker, shadowed by overhanging branches and hedges that blocked the distant sound of music from the ballroom. Arabella felt the first flutter of genuine unease. "Perhaps we should return," she said. "I would not wish to be missed by my aunt." In a moment. His grip on her arm tightened almost imperceptibly. "I find I am enjoying our conversation far too much to cut it short. Tell me more about yourself, Miss Fairfax. What brings you to London this season?" "What do you hope to find?" "A husband," she thought, "before my family runs out of money and I am forced into governessing." But that was hardly the sort of answer one gave to a duke. "I suppose I hope to find what everyone hopes to find," she said carefully. "A suitable match, a stable future, the usual things." The usual things. He was steering her toward a shadowed alcove she had not noticed before, a small stone bench surrounded by tall hedges that blocked the view from the main path. "And tell me, Miss Fairfax, in your hunt for a suitable match, are you willing to be a bit unconventional?" The flutter of unease became a full wing beat of alarm. "I'm not certain what you mean." only that sometimes the direct approach yields better results than endless dancing around the matter. You approached me directly, after all. Without introduction, without the usual games. I find that rather admirable. Your Grace Sebastian, I think we should return to the ballroom. Do you? He smiled, and there was something in that smile that made her blood run cold. How unfortunate. I rather thought we were getting along so well. She tried to pull her arm from his grip, but his fingers tightened with surprising strength. Let me go. In a moment. I only want to— I believe, said a voice from the shadows, that the lady asked to be released. They both spun toward the sound. A man stood at the entrance to the alcove, barely visible in the darkness, his form tall and broad-shouldered against the distant torchlight. His face was in shadow, his features indistinguishable. But something about his posture radiated quiet authority, the stillness of a predator who did not need to move quickly because he knew his prey could not escape. "This is a private conversation," the golden-haired man said sharply. "You are intruding." "Am I?" The stranger stepped forward, just enough for the faint light to catch the angular planes of his face. Dark hair silvered at the temples, storm-grey eyes that seemed to see everything while revealing nothing. A face that might have been carved from marble for all the emotion it displayed. "My apologies. I was merely searching for Miss Fairfax, who I believe promised me the next dance. We have met before, you see, and I have been seeking her all evening." Arabella had never seen this man before in her life. She was absolutely certain of it. She would have remembered a face like that, a presence like that, eyes that cut through the darkness like blades. But something in his steady gaze told her to play along, and she had never been so grateful for a stranger's interference. "Mr.—" She let the question hang, hoping he would provide a name. "Ashworth," he said smoothly. "We met at Lady Pemberton's musicale, if you recall, a distant connection of the Thornwood family. I have been hoping for the opportunity to continue our conversation about— Was it Wollstonecraft?" He knew. Somehow, impossibly, he knew that she had read Wollstonecraft, that mentioning the name would establish them as conspirators in some game whose rules she did not yet understand. She grabbed the lifeline with both hands. "Of course, Mr. Ashworth. How could I forget?" "I apologize for wandering off. I was merely taking some air before our dance." The golden-haired man's expression had shifted from charming to calculating to something cold and furious, all in the space of a few heartbeats. "I see. Well then, I would not wish to keep you from your engagement." He released her arm with a grace that was almost insulting in its smoothness, as though he had not been gripping her tightly enough to leave marks mere seconds before. "It was a pleasure meeting you, Miss Fairfax. I do hope we will have the opportunity to continue our acquaintance." "Your Grace is too kind," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. Something flickered across the stranger's Mr. Ashworth's face at her use of the title, but he said nothing. He merely offered his arm with quiet courtesy, and when she took it, she felt the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. They walked in silence until they reached the torchlit main path, safely in view of other guests, far from the shadowed alcove and the man whose charm had concealed something much darker. Only then did Arabella allow herself to breathe. "I don't know who you are," she said quietly, "or why you intervened, or how you knew to say what you said. But thank you. I believe you may have saved me from something unpleasant." "I believe I may have," he agreed, and his voice was low and measured, as careful as his face was unreadable. "Are you hurt?" "No, only shaken and confused." She looked up at him, trying to read those storm-grey eyes. "You are not actually a connection of the Thornwood family, are you?" "I am, in a manner of speaking." "And we did not meet at Lady Pemberton's musicale?" "We did not." "Then how did you know the Wollstonecraft—" I overheard a conversation between you and your aunt earlier in the evening. You have a remarkably carrying voice when you are being sardonic." She should have been embarrassed, but instead she found herself almost laughing, a slightly hysterical laugh, perhaps, but a laugh nonetheless. "So you were eavesdropping on my humiliation and decided to make use of the intelligence thus gathered." "I was observing. There is a difference." He glanced down at her with something that might have been the ghost of a smile, though I confess the intelligence did prove useful. They had reached the doors leading back to the ballroom. Through the glass, Arabella could see the swirl of dancers, the blaze of candles, her aunt craning her neck in search of her wayward niece, the real world waiting to reclaim her. "I should go in," she said reluctantly. "My aunt will be frantic." "Yes." He released her arm, but did not step away. "Miss Fairfax, a word of advice, if I may." "Advice from a mysterious stranger who appears from shadows and speaks of Wollstonecraft. I cannot imagine refusing." "The man you were speaking with?" Something flickered in his grey eyes. Anger, perhaps, or something colder. "He is not who he claims to be. Be wary of him." "Not who he claims to be? But he said my aunt said—" She stopped, replaying the garden conversation in her mind. "He told me to call him Sebastian. He said he was weary of being called Your Grace." "I am certain he did." The implication struck her like a physical blow. "He's not the Duke. The man I curtsied to, the man I called Your Grace. He's not the Duke of Thornwood at all." Mr. Ashworth said nothing, but his silence was confirmation enough. "Then who is he? And who are you, that you would know such a thing, and intervene to save a stranger from whatever he was planning?" "Those are excellent questions, Miss Fairfax." He reached for the door handle, holding it open for her. "Perhaps some day I will answer them. For now, accept that I am someone who watches carefully and occasionally chooses to act on what I see." A cryptic response from a cryptic man. How unsurprising. I find clarity is often overrated. This time the ghost of a smile reached his eyes, warming them fractionally. "It was a pleasure meeting you, Miss Fairfax. Truly meeting you, I mean. Not whatever fiction I fabricated about musicales. The pleasure was mine, Mr. Ashworth, if that is actually your name." "It is. That much, at least, is true." She wanted to say more, to demand answers, to understand what had just happened, and why this stranger had bothered to save her from a predator she had not recognized. But her aunt was already bearing down on them with the unstoppable force of maternal ambition, and Mr. Ashworth was already melting back into the crowd with an ease that suggested long practice in the art of disappearing. "Arabella!" Lady Whitmore seized her arm with visible relief. "Where have you been? You disappeared for nearly an hour. I thought you were with the Duke. I saw you walk toward the garden together." "I was. We walked. We talked." Arabella watched Mr. Ashworth's dark head vanish into the sea of guests. "And then I came back." "And? What happened? What did he say? Did he ask to call on you? Did he suggest—" "He was not what I expected." Her aunt's face fell slightly. "Ah, well, dukes rarely are at first. They are accustomed to deference, you see, and sometimes mistake their own rudeness for charm. But you made an impression, surely. He spoke to you for an entire hour, which is more than he has given any young lady this season. That must mean something." "It means I curtsied to the wrong man," Arabella thought. "It means I was alone in a dark garden with someone dangerous, while the real Duke or his connection watched from the shadows and said nothing until the last possible moment." But she could not say any of that. She did not fully understand it herself. "I believe I made an impression," she said finally, "though not perhaps the one we intended." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of music and small talk, and watching, always watching for either the golden-haired impostor or the grey-eyed stranger to reappear. Neither did. The false Duke had apparently left the ball entirely, and Mr. Ashworth seemed to have dissolved into shadow as completely as if he had never existed. When they finally climbed into the carriage to return home, Arabella pressed her forehead against the cool window glass and tried to make sense of what had happened. She had curtsied to a man she believed to be a duke. She had walked into a garden with a predator wearing a charming mask. She had been rescued by a stranger who knew her secrets and spoke in riddles and disappeared before she could demand answers. "He is not who he claims to be," Mr. Ashworth had said. But that raised more questions than it answered. Who was the false Duke, and what had he wanted with her? Why had Mr. Ashworth intervened? What did a distant connection of the Thornwood family have to gain from saving a financially embarrassed gentlewoman from a fortune hunter, if that's what the false Duke was? And why, when she closed her eyes, was it not the handsome impostor's face she saw, but the stranger's grey gaze, watching her from the shadows with an expression she could not read? The house was quiet when they returned, most of the servants already abed. Lady Whitmore retired immediately, exhausted by the evening's social manoeuvring and already planning her strategy for the next ball. Arabella claimed similar fatigue but found herself unable to sleep. She sat in her small bedroom, candle burning low, and replayed the night's events until her head ached from the effort of understanding them. Shorter answers, her aunt had instructed, fewer opinions, more demure smiles. She had tried. She really had. And where had it gotten her? Alone in a dark garden with a man who had looked at her like prey, saved only by the intervention of another man who clearly knew far more than he was willing to share. If she had been her true self, sharp-tongued, opinionated, too much, would the false Duke have targeted her at all? Was there something about her performance of demure agreeability that had marked her as a victim, someone who could be led astray with compliments and charm? Or was she simply unlucky, as she had always been unlucky, destined to stumble into situations that more sensible women would have avoided? She did not know. She knew only that the evening had changed something in her, shaken loose some certainty she had not realized she was holding on to. The rules she had been given, shorter answers, fewer opinions, more demure smiles, had not protected her. If anything, they had made her vulnerable. Stripping away the sharp edges that might have warned a predator, she was not easy prey. "Be wary of him," Mr. Ashworth had said. She would. But she found herself hoping, despite everything, that their paths would cross again. There had been something in his grey eyes, some flicker of recognition or understanding, that made her think he saw her. Not the performance, not the demure, agreeable version her aunt demanded, but her. The woman who laughed too loudly and read Wollstonecraft and helped frightened girls with torn hems. It was probably foolish to read so much into a brief encounter with a stranger. But then, Arabella had always been foolish in exactly the ways that mattered. She blew out the candle and went to bed, but it was a long time before she slept. Across London, in a study lined with books and shadows, Sebastian Ashworth, 7th Duke of Thornwood, sat in darkness and asked himself why he had lied. It would have been easy enough to tell her the truth. "I am the Duke. The man you curtsied to is an impostor, a fortune hunter named Reginald Blackwood, who has ruined at least 4 women that I know of. You were nearly his 5th victim, and I intervened because I have spent years gathering evidence of his crimes, and I will not allow him to add you to his list. Simple, honest, complete." Instead, he had called himself Mr. Ashworth. A distant connection of the Thornwood family. He had let her believe the golden-haired predator was the real Duke, had offered no correction when she expressed confusion about the title. He had watched her curtsy to the wrong man and said nothing until she was already in danger. Why? The tactical explanation was reasonable enough. Blackwood did not yet know that Sebastian was actively working to destroy him. If Miss Fairfax returned to society, believing she had met the Duke of Thornwood in the garden, believing Sebastian was merely a distant relation who had interrupted an uncomfortable encounter. Blackwood's suspicions would not be aroused. Sebastian could continue gathering evidence, continue building his case, continue positioning himself to strike when Blackwood least expected it. But that was not the whole truth, and Sebastian was too honest with himself to pretend otherwise. The whole truth was that when he had watched her cross the ballroom, copper hair refusing to stay pinned, face expressive despite her obvious attempts to control it, laughter visible in the corners of her mouth, even when she was trying to be serious, he had felt something shift in his chest, something he had not felt in years, if ever. And when she had curtsied to the wrong man, when she had called Blackwood "Your Grace," with such earnest nervousness, he had found himself frozen. Not with strategic calculation, but with something far more personal. For one moment, he admitted to the darkness, "I wanted to be someone else. Not a title, not a fortune, not a weapon or a prize. Just a man who might be able to speak to a copper-haired woman without watching her face change when she learned what he was worth. It was foolish. It was irresponsible. It was potentially dangerous for her as much as for him. If Blackwood discovered that the Duke of Thornwood was taking an interest in Miss Arabella Fairfax, he might decide to accelerate his plans, to compromise her before Sebastian could intervene again. Sebastian should tell her the truth immediately, should reveal himself, explain the situation, warn her properly about the danger she was in. It was the responsible thing to do. Instead, he found himself remembering the way she had looked at him when she asked if Ashworth was actually his name. The curiosity in her hazel eyes, unguarded and genuine. The gratitude when she thanked him for saving her, before she knew enough to calculate what that gratitude might be worth. She had seen him, not the Duke, not the fortune, not the cold, silent shadow that society whispered about. Just him. "I am my father's son," he reminded himself harshly. "Whatever I feel, it will curdle into something dark eventually. It always does. That is what the Ashworth men do. We take bright things and destroy them." But his father had been impulsive, passionate, violent in his loves and hatreds. Sebastian had spent years constructing himself as the opposite, careful, controlled, patient. He watched from shadows because shadows were safe. He acted through manipulation rather than confrontation because manipulation left no marks. Surely, he could control this as he controlled everything else. He would continue watching Miss Arabella Fairfax for her own protection, of course. He would continue gathering evidence against Blackwood. He would maintain his disguise as a distant Ashworth connection until the moment was right to reveal everything. And if, in the process, he found excuses to speak with her again, to hear her opinions and watch her face change when she forgot to hide her reactions, well, that was simply good surveillance. Nothing more. Sebastian poured himself a glass of brandy and drank it in the darkness, trying very hard to believe his own lies. 3 days after the Hartwell ball, Arabella found herself standing in Hatchard's bookshop on Piccadilly, pretending to examine a volume of sermons while actually reading a Gothic novel she had hidden inside its respectable cover. It was the sort of deception she had perfected over years of being told that young ladies should not read sensational fiction, and she felt only slightly guilty about it. The shop was quiet at this hour, most of society still recovering from the previous night's entertainments or preparing for the evenings. Arabella had escaped her aunt's house under the pretense of needing new gloves, a mission she had accomplished in approximately 4 minutes before making her way to the bookshop that had been her refuge during every London season. She was deeply absorbed in a passage involving a mysterious stranger and a crumbling castle when a familiar voice spoke from somewhere behind her left shoulder. "I see you have developed a passion for sermons since we last met. How edifying!" Arabella startled so violently that she nearly dropped both books, only barely managing to catch them before they hit the floor. She spun around to find Mr. Ashworth standing in the shadows between two towering bookshelves, watching her with that unreadable grey gaze she remembered from the garden. "Mr. Ashworth," she pressed a hand to her racing heart, "you have a talent for appearing from nowhere. Has anyone ever mentioned that it is somewhat alarming?" "Once or twice." He stepped forward into the watery light from the shop's windows, and she was struck again by the severity of his features, all sharp angles and shadows, softened only by those prematurely silver temples, and something that might have been amusement lurking in the corners of his mouth. "Though I confess I did not expect to find you here. Most young ladies of the season spend their afternoons making calls or being fitted for gowns. Most young ladies of the season have not read every novel in their aunt's library twice over and developed a desperate need for new material." She glanced down at the books in her hands and realized the Gothic novel's cover was now clearly visible. "Ah, well, I suppose there is no point in pretending I was genuinely interested in sermons." "None whatsoever, though I am curious about your choice of hiding place. Sermons seem rather obvious. Anyone with sense would suspect something concealed within." "And what would you suggest instead?" "Agricultural treatises. No one ever opens those." She laughed before she could stop herself, the sound echoing through the quiet shop. "Spoken like a man with extensive experience hiding his reading material. Should I assume you have a passion for Gothic novels as well?" "I have a passion for information of all kinds." He moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could smell something clean and masculine soap, perhaps, and something darker underneath, like wood smoke or leather. "Including information about the man you met at the Hartwell ball." The lightness of the moment evaporated. Arabella's smile faded, replaced by the wariness she had been carrying since that night in the garden. "You said he was not who he claimed to be. You never explained what you meant." "No, I did not." "Will you explain now?" Mr. Ashworth was silent for a long moment, his grey eyes studying her face as though searching for something. Whatever he found seemed to satisfy him, because he finally spoke again in a low voice that would not carry beyond the narrow aisle where they stood. "His name is Lord Reginald Blackwood. He is a fortune hunter, though that term does not begin to capture what he truly is. He has made a career of targeting young women of good family and limited resources, women whose desperation makes them vulnerable to his particular brand of charm. Targeting them for what purpose? Compromise, marriage, access to whatever funds or connections they possess." Mr. Ashworth's jaw tightened. "And when they have nothing left to offer him, he discards them, one way or another." Arabella felt cold despite the warmth of the afternoon. "How do you know all this?" "I have been watching him for some time." "Why?" Again that searching look, as though he were weighing how much to reveal. "Because I have resources that others lack. Because I am in a position to see patterns that might otherwise go unnoticed. Because someone should." "That is not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It is not." She should have pressed harder, demanded the full truth, insisted on understanding why this mysterious man had appointed himself guardian of vulnerable women, and what connection, if any, he truly had to the Thornwood family. But something in his expression stopped her, a shadow of pain or guilt that flickered across his features so quickly she might have imagined it. "You saved me," she said instead. "In the garden. I have been thinking about it constantly since that night, wondering what would have happened if you had not appeared when you did. Nothing good. No. I rather suspected that." She tucked the Gothic novel more firmly under her arm, abandoning all pretense of hiding it. "I should thank you properly. I was too shaken that night to say it adequately. There is no need. There is every need. I was—" She stopped, swallowed, forced herself to continue. "I was trying so hard to be what my aunt wanted. Demure, agreeable, empty-headed. I was so focused on performing that I did not see what he truly was until it was nearly too late. You saw. You acted. That deserves acknowledgement. Something shifted in Mr. Ashworth's expression, a softening, perhaps, or a deepening of that unreadable intensity. You should not blame yourself for his deception. Blackwood is very good at what he does. He has had years of practice. Nevertheless, I walked willingly into a dark garden with a stranger because my aunt told me he was a duke, and I was too desperate for a good match to question it. Arabella heard the bitterness in her own voice and did not try to hide it. That is not his fault. That is mine. Desperation is not a character flaw, Miss Fairfax. It is a circumstance. A circumstance I seem unable to escape. She met his eyes directly, suddenly tired of pretense. You said you have been watching Lord Blackwood. Have you also been watching me? The question hung between them. Mr. Ashworth did not look away. Yes, he said finally, though not for the reasons you might imagine. What reasons should I imagine? I wanted to ensure Blackwood had not made further attempts to approach you. You are not his usual type of target. You have neither the fortune nor the connections he typically pursues, but he was clearly interested in you at the ball, and that interest concerned me. Not his usual type. Arabella smiled humorlessly. How flattering. I am not even worth ruining properly. That is not... He stopped, something flickering across his face that looked almost like frustration. You misunderstand. My concern was not that you lacked value, but that he saw value in you despite your circumstances. Blackwood is not a man who acts without calculation. If he pursued you, it was for a reason, and I have been trying to determine what that reason might be. And have you? Not yet. She considered this, turning the information over in her mind like a puzzle piece that did not quite fit. You are an unusual man, Mr. Ashworth. You appear from shadows, speak in riddles, and apparently spend your time protecting women from fortune hunters, while declining to explain your motivations. I am not certain whether to be grateful or alarmed. Both, perhaps. I have been told I inspire that particular combination frequently. I can believe it. She glanced toward the front of the shop, where the bookseller was beginning to look their way with undisguised curiosity. They had been talking too long in the shadows between the shelves. Their behavior was beginning to look improper. I should go. My aunt will wonder what has become of me, and I have already been gone longer than glove shopping should require. Of course. Mr. Ashworth stepped back, creating proper distance between them, but as she began to move past him, he spoke again. Miss Fairfax, if Lord Blackwood approaches you again in any context, at any event, send word to me immediately. A note to the Thornwood townhouse on Berkeley Square will reach me. The Thornwood townhouse. I thought you said you were a distant connection of the family. I am, but the current Duke allows me use of his correspondence address. His expression gave nothing away. It is a convenient arrangement. Convenient? She repeated skeptically. Yes, that is certainly one word for it. She purchased the Gothic novel openly, if the bookseller thought it an odd choice. He was too professional to say so, and left the shop with more questions than she had entered with. Mr. Ashworth did not follow her, but she felt his gaze on her back until she turned the corner and disappeared from view. The next several days brought a flurry of social engagements that left Arabella exhausted and no closer to understanding either the man who had saved her or the man who had nearly ruined her. Lord Blackwood did not appear at any of the events she attended, which should have been a relief, but instead made her nervous. Where was he? What was he planning? Had Mr. Ashworth's intervention been enough to drive him off, or was he simply biding his time? Mr. Ashworth, by contrast, seemed to be everywhere she looked. At Lady Pemberton's musicale, the very event he had falsely claimed they had previously attended, She spotted him standing in the shadows near the back of the room, watching the performers with apparent disinterest. At a garden party hosted by the Viscountess of Hartley, he appeared beside the refreshment table just as Arabella was reaching for a glass of lemonade, offering her one before she could serve herself. "You are following me," she said flatly, accepting the lemonade because refusing it would have been more conspicuous than accepting. "I prefer to think of it as maintaining a protective proximity. That is merely a more elaborate way of saying you are following me." "Perhaps." He took a glass of lemonade for himself, though she noticed he did not drink from it. "How are you finding Lady Hartley's garden party?" "Tedious. The conversation at my table has focused exclusively on bonnet ribbons and the marital prospects of various absent young ladies. I was contemplating feigning a headache when you appeared. My timing, as always, is impeccable. Your modesty is truly inspiring." He almost smiled at that. She saw the corner of his mouth twitch, caught a flash of warmth in those grey eyes before he controlled it. "Walk with me, Miss Fairfax. There is a path along the hedge that offers an excellent view of the roses and the additional benefit of being far from any discussion of bonnet ribbons." She should have refused. She should have returned to her table and the tedious conversation and the endless performance of being someone she was not. Instead, she set down her lemonade glass and followed him toward the roses, telling herself it was merely because she wanted answers. They walked in silence for a few minutes, following the hedge path until the main party was hidden from view. The roses were indeed beautiful great cascades of pink and white and deep crimson, their scent heavy in the warm afternoon air. Arabella tried to focus on their beauty and not on the man walking beside her, whose presence seemed to take up far more space than his physical form would suggest. "You have been watching me," she said finally, "at multiple events. That goes beyond protecting me from Lord Blackwood." "Does it?" "Unless you believe he is about to emerge from behind a rose bush, yes. I think it does." Mr. Ashworth was quiet for a moment, his attention apparently fixed on a particularly spectacular bloom. When he spoke, his voice was lower than before. "I find myself curious about you, Miss Fairfax, in ways I cannot entirely explain." Curious. She was not certain whether to be flattered or insulted. "Like a specimen under a naturalist's glass. Like a puzzle I cannot quite solve." He turned to look at her, and there was something different in his expression now, something almost vulnerable beneath the controlled exterior. "At the Hartwell ball, you helped a frightened young woman with a torn hem. You spent 20 minutes ensuring her comfort, while the greatest matrimonial opportunity of the season awaited you across the ballroom. Why?" Arabella blinked, caught off guard by the question. "How do you know about that?" "I told you, I watch." "You were watching me even then? Before the garden?" "I was watching everything. It is what I do." He did not look away from her face. "Answer the question, please. Why did you help her?" "Because she needed help. Because I remembered being that frightened at my first ball. Because—" She paused, searching for words that would not sound pathetically earnest. "Because it was the right thing to do. And doing the right thing is so rarely complicated. The complicated things are all the wrong things, the performances, the pretenses, the endless calculation of what to say and how to say it. Helping a frightened girl with a torn hem was simple, clean. I suppose I needed something simple that night. You sacrificed your chance at the Duke to help a stranger. I sacrificed my chance at a man I had never met to help a person standing in front of me. It did not seem like a difficult choice at the time." She smiled ruefully. "Of course, I later learned that the man I thought was the Duke was actually a fortune hunter who would have ruined me. So perhaps my instincts were wiser than I knew." Mr. Ashworth said nothing for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was rougher than she had heard it before. "You are not what I expected, Miss Fairfax." "What did you expect?" I am not certain any more." He began walking again, more slowly now, and she fell into step beside him. "Tell me about yourself. Not the version you present to society, the version your aunt has coached you to perform. The real version. The one that reads Gothic novels hidden inside sermon covers and laughs without caring who hears and speaks her mind, even when it costs her." The request was so unexpected, so nakedly genuine, that Arabella found herself answering before she could think better of it. "I am the eldest daughter of a gentleman whose estate is failing. My father has made poor investments, and my mother has expensive tastes, and between them they have ensured that my sisters and I must marry well or find employment. I have failed to marry well for 2 seasons, running too sharp-tongued, too opinionated, too much of everything gentlemen apparently do not want. This is my 3rd and final attempt. If I do not secure a match this season, I will become a governess and spend the rest of my life pretending to be something smaller than I am." She expected pity, perhaps, or the kind of embarrassed sympathy that well-bred people offered to those less fortunate. Instead, Mr. Ashworth simply nodded, as though she had confirmed something he had already suspected. "And what do you want, Miss Fairfax? Not what your family needs, not what society expects. What do you want for yourself?" No one had ever asked her that. Not once, in 23 years of life. Her throat tightened with an emotion she did not want to name. "I want to be known," she said, and her voice came out rougher than she intended. "Truly known, not just the version of myself I show to the world. I want someone to see all of me, the parts that are too much, the parts I have learned to hide, the parts that make me unsuitable for polite company and not look away. I want—" She stopped, shook her head. "It does not matter what I want. What matters is what I can reasonably achieve, and that is a very different thing." "It matters," he said quietly. "It matters more than you know." They had reached a small stone bench at the end of the rose path, hidden from the main party by a wall of climbing vines. Arabella sat down without thinking, suddenly exhausted by the effort of speaking so honestly. Mr. Ashworth remained standing, looking down at her with an expression she could not read. "May I tell you something, Miss Fairfax? Something I have not told anyone else?" "You may tell me whatever you like. I seem to have temporarily lost my talent for discretion. I understand what you mean when you say you want to be known." He said the words slowly, carefully, as though testing their weight. "I have spent my entire adult life building walls between myself and the world. I have convinced myself that it is safer to watch from shadows than to step into the light. But lately—" He paused, his jaw tightening. "Lately, I have begun to wonder if safety and loneliness are so different in the end." Arabella looked up at him, at this strange, severe man who appeared from nowhere and spoke in riddles and somehow understood her better than anyone she had ever met. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you asked me to be honest." "Because I find that I want to be honest with you, even when it frightens me." He sat down on the bench beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body through the layers of their clothing. "Because I believe you might understand." "I might," she agreed, "though I am still not certain I understand anything else about you. Who you truly are, why you watch and protect and refuse to explain yourself, what connection you actually have to the Thornwood family beyond sharing a surname." Something flickered across his face. Guilt, perhaps, or the shadow of a secret he was not yet ready to share. "There are things I cannot tell you yet, Miss Fairfax. Not because I do not trust you, but because telling them would change everything, and I am not ready for everything to change." "That is rather cryptic." "Yes." "I apologize." "Do not apologize. Just—" She hesitated, then made a decision that felt reckless and right in equal measure. "Just promise me that I promise." He held her gaze as he said it, and she believed him. believed him with a certainty that defied logic, that trusted something in his eyes she could not name. "When I am ready, I will tell you everything." They sat in silence for a moment, the sounds of the party drifting to them from beyond the vine-covered wall. Birds sang in the garden. Roses perfumed the air. And Arabella Fairfax, who had spent 3 seasons searching for a suitable match, realized with growing alarm that she was developing feelings for a man she barely knew, a man who spoke in riddles and watched from shadows, and might be anything at all beneath the mask he wore. "I should return to the party," she said, rising from the bench. "I have been gone too long." "Of course." He rose as well, offering his arm to escort her back. "Miss Fairfax, whatever happens, whatever you learn about me in the future, please remember this conversation. Remember that I told you the truth when I could, even if I could not tell you all of it. You speak as though you expect me to hate you eventually. I speak as a man who knows his own failings." He guided her back along the rose path, toward the noise and brightness of the party. "But I hope you will not hate me. I find that hope rather more painful than I expected." She had no answer for that, so she said nothing. But as they emerged from the privacy of the roses and into the public space of the garden party, she felt something shift between them, a connection that went beyond gratitude or curiosity, a thread of understanding that would not be easily broken. Her aunt intercepted her within moments, clucking disapproval about lengthy absences and missed opportunities. Mr. Ashworth melted back into the crowd before Arabella could introduce him, disappearing as completely as he always did. But this time, she knew he was still watching, and for reasons she did not want to examine too closely, she found that knowledge more comforting than alarming. The arrival of Catherine Fairfax in London happened without warning, in the small hours of a Tuesday morning, heralded by a frantic pounding on the servants' entrance that woke the entire household. Arabella was the first to reach the kitchen, having slept poorly and been reading by candlelight when the commotion began. She found her 16-year-old sister standing in the doorway, travel-stained and tear-streaked, clutching a small valise with both hands as though her life depended on it. "Catherine!" Arabella caught her sister as she swayed, pulling her into the warmth of the kitchen. "What on earth? How did you—" "I ran away." Catherine's voice was hoarse, as though she had been crying for hours. "I had to. I could not, Bella. They want me to marry Mr. Thornbury." The name hit Arabella like a physical blow. Mr. Thornbury was their father's creditor, a wealthy widower of nearly 60 years, with a reputation for vice that even polite society could not entirely conceal. His first wife had died in childbirth. His second had died of a fever that some whispered was not a fever at all. And now, apparently, he had set his sights on Catherine, beautiful, sweet, 16-year-old Catherine, who had never been to London and had never done anything wrong and did not deserve to be sold to a monster to pay their father's debts. "They cannot," Arabella said, though even as she spoke the words she knew they were false. Their father could do exactly as he pleased with his daughters. That was the law. That was the world. "They cannot possibly. They can. They will. The wedding is set for next month. Papa said—" Catherine's voice broke. "Papa said it was the only way to save the family, that Mr. Thornbury would forgive his debts and provide for all of us if I would just—" She could not finish the sentence. She did not need to. Arabella held her sister tightly, mind racing through possibilities and finding none of them viable. Catherine could not stay here. Their aunt would inform their parents immediately, and Catherine would be returned to face whatever punishment awaited runaways. She could not go to friends. A 16-year-old girl fleeing an arranged marriage had no friends who would shelter her against her family's wishes. She could not simply disappear into London. She had no money, no connections, no skills that would allow her to survive alone. There was no good option. There was no safe harbour. There was only Arabella, who had failed to secure a match that might have provided alternative resources, who had wasted 3 seasons being too much of everything while her little sister was being prepared for sacrifice. "Stay quiet," she whispered to Catherine. "Stay in my room. I will think of something." "What? What can you possibly—" "I do not know yet, but I will not let them give you to that man. I swear it." She settled Catherine in her bedroom with what food she could quietly gather from the kitchen, then spent the remaining hours until dawn pacing and planning and rejecting every plan she could conceive. By the time the sun rose, she was exhausted, desperate, and possessed of only one idea that might actually work. She needed resources she did not have. Power she had never possessed. She needed someone who could hide a 16-year-old girl from her own family, someone with money and influence and a willingness to act outside the boundaries of polite society. She needed Mr. Ashworth. The note she sent to the Thornwood townhouse was brief and cryptic, in case it was intercepted. "I require your assistance urgently. The garden where we walked at Lady Hartley's party. 2 o'clock. She spent the morning pretending normalcy, enduring her aunt's breakfast conversation about upcoming events and eligible gentlemen, while Catherine hid in her bedroom, and the clock moved with agonizing slowness toward 2 o'clock. When she finally escaped the house, pleading a headache that required fresh air, she nearly ran the entire way to the Hartley garden. Mr. Ashworth was already there, waiting on the stone bench where they had sat 2 days before. He rose as she approached, and something in his expression shifted when he saw her face. "What has happened?" She told him. All of it: Catherine's arrival, the arranged marriage, Mr. Thornbury's reputation, their father's debts, the wedding scheduled for next month. She spoke quickly, words tumbling over each other in her desperation to convey the full horror of the situation. When she finished, Mr. Ashworth was silent for a long moment. His face had gone hard in a way she had not seen before, carved from stone and ice, and something that looked very much like rage. "Where is she now?" "Hidden in my bedroom. But my aunt will discover her eventually. The servants will talk. Someone will see her. I cannot hide her for more than a day or 2 at most. Then we must move her somewhere safer." "Where?" "I have thought of everywhere I might send her, everyone who might help, and there is no one. Our family will look for her. They will find her, and when they do, they will not find her." Mr. Ashworth spoke with absolute certainty, as though he were stating a law of nature rather than making a promise. "I know of a house where she can stay. It is owned by a friend of mine, discreet, loyal, impossible to connect to your family. She can remain there until we find a more permanent solution." "A friend of yours?" Arabella studied his face, searching for some sign of what he was truly offering. "This would be a tremendous risk for your friend. If my father discovered he was sheltering a runaway, my friend is accustomed to risk, and to protecting those who cannot protect themselves. Why would he do this? Why would you?" Mr. Ashworth's expression softened fractionally. "Because you asked me to. Because your sister deserves protection. Because I have resources that can help, and refusing to use them would make me complicit in whatever happens to her." Arabella felt tears prick at her eyes, hot, unwelcome tears that she furiously blinked away. She had spent so many years being too much, wanting too much, needing too much. And now, when she needed help most desperately, here was this strange, shadowy man offering it without hesitation or conditions. "I do not know how to thank you." "You do not need to thank me. You need to bring your sister to this address." He produced a card from his pocket, pressed it into her hand. "Tonight, after dark. There will be a carriage waiting for you at the corner of your aunt's street. Can you manage that?" "Yes. Yes." "Good." He held her gaze for a moment longer, and something passed between them, understanding, perhaps, or the recognition of a connection that went beyond mere circumstance. "I will ensure everything is ready." He turned to leave, and Arabella caught his arm before she could think better of it. "Mr. Ashworth, why are you doing this? Not just for Catherine, all of it. The watching, the protecting, the appearing from shadows to help women you barely know. What drives you?" He looked down at her hand on his arm, then back up at her face. When he spoke, his voice was rough. "I have spent my life watching people be destroyed by those with more power than they possess. I have seen what men do when they believe no one is watching, when they believe no one will stop them. For a long time, I convinced myself that watching was enough, that observing and documenting and occasionally intervening from the shadows was all I could offer." He paused, and something shifted in his grey eyes. "But lately I have begun to wonder if I have been hiding from responsibility by calling it strategy. If perhaps watching from the shadows is not protection at all, but cowardice dressed up as caution. And my sister? Is helping her strategy or something else?" "Something else," he admitted. "Something I do not entirely understand. Your sister deserves protection because she is a child facing a monster, but I would be lying if I said that was my only motivation." "What is your other motivation?" He was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. You are my other motivation, and I am not yet certain whether that makes what I am doing more noble or less." He pulled gently away from her grip and walked into the garden, disappearing around a hedge before she could formulate a response. Arabella stood alone among the roses, his card clutched in her hand, her heart beating with a rhythm she did not recognize. The extraction of Catherine from Lady Whitmore's house went more smoothly than Arabella had dared hope. She pleaded exhaustion immediately after dinner, retired to her room, and helped her sister slip out through the servants' entrance while the household was occupied with evening activities. The carriage was waiting exactly where Mr. Ashworth had promised, plain and unmarked, driven by a coachman who asked no questions. The house they arrived at was modest from the outside, a respectable townhouse in a quiet neighborhood, the sort of place that attracted no attention precisely because it had nothing notable about it. But inside, Arabella found comfortable rooms, a fire already burning, and a housekeeper who greeted them with the efficient warmth of someone accustomed to sheltering unexpected guests. "Miss Catherine is most welcome to stay as long as necessary," the housekeeper said, leading them up a staircase lined with unremarkable landscape paintings. "Her room is prepared, and meals will be brought on a tray until she feels comfortable appearing below stairs. Mr. Ashworth has given explicit instructions that her privacy is to be protected absolutely." "Mr. Ashworth's friend, you mean?" Arabella corrected. "This is his friend's house." The housekeeper's expression flickered with something that might have been amusement. "Of course, miss. Mr. Ashworth's friend. My apologies for the confusion." Catherine was too exhausted to notice the odd exchange. She collapsed into the bed in her new room and was asleep within minutes, the stress of the past days finally catching up with her. Arabella sat beside her for a long while, watching her sister breathe and thinking about all the things she did not understand. Mr. Ashworth's friend, the Thornwood townhouse as a correspondence address, the way the housekeeper had looked when Arabella mentioned the supposed owner of the house. The pieces were beginning to form a picture, but she could not quite see its shape. Over the following week, Arabella divided her time between maintaining appearances at social events and visiting Catherine at the safe house. Her sister's spirits improved daily as the fear of immediate discovery faded, and she began to speak of the future with something almost like hope. "Perhaps I could become a governess," Catherine said one afternoon, curled up in a window seat with a book from the house's surprisingly extensive library. "You always said you would rather governessing than marriage to the wrong man. If it is good enough for you, surely it is good enough for me." "Governessing was my fallback position, not my ambition," Arabella replied dryly. "And you are 16. You have years before you need to make such decisions." "I am 16, and I was nearly sold to pay our father's debts. I think my years of carefree youth may already be behind me." There was no arguing with that logic, so Arabella did not try. Mr. Ashworth visited the house periodically, appearing without warning in his customary fashion, and disappearing just as quickly after brief, cryptic exchanges. He reported that Lord Blackwood had not been seen at any recent social events, a development he found concerning rather than reassuring. "Blackwood does not simply give up on a target," he said, during one such visit, while Catherine napped upstairs and Arabella sat in the modest parlour pretending to be calm. "If he has withdrawn from society, it is because he is planning something." "Planning what?" "I do not know yet, but I am trying to find out." Their conversations during these visits were careful, constrained by the presence of servants and the awareness that Catherine might wake at any moment. But beneath the careful words, Arabella felt the same current of connection that had sparked between them in Lady Hartley's garden, the sense that they understood each other in ways that went beyond the circumstances that had brought them together. She was falling in love with him, she realized during one such visit. Falling in love with a man she barely knew, a man who spoke in riddles and kept secrets and might be anyone at all beneath the mask he wore. It was foolish. It was dangerous. It was exactly the sort of reckless emotional attachment that had caused her so much trouble throughout her life, and she could not seem to stop it. The crisis, when it came, arrived in the form of Lord Reginald Blackwood. Arabella was attending a ball at the home of the Earl of Westmore, performing the exhausting dance of eligibility that her aunt still insisted upon, when she spotted the golden-haired predator across the crowded room. He was watching her with a smile that made her skin crawl, the smile of a cat that has cornered a particularly interesting mouse. She tried to avoid him, but he was skilled at maneuvering through crowds, and before she could escape to her aunt's side, he had intercepted her near the refreshment table. "Miss Fairfax." He spoke her name like a caress, like a threat. "What a pleasure to see you again. I confess I was disappointed when our garden conversation was interrupted so abruptly. I had hoped to know you much better." "Lord Blackwood." She kept her voice level, though her heart was racing. "I did not expect to see you this evening." "Did you not? I have been away from London for a few days, attending to some personal business. But I could not stay away forever, not when such delightful company awaited me here. I'm afraid I cannot stay to chat. My aunt is expecting me." "Your aunt can wait." He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne, expensive and cloying. "I have been wanting to speak with you privately, Miss Fairfax, to discuss some matters that I think you will find very interesting." "I cannot imagine what matters we would have to discuss." "No?" His smile widened, and there was something cruel in it now, something that had been hidden beneath charm before. "Not even the matter of your sister? Your 16-year-old sister, who ran away from home rather than marry the creditor your father had promised her to?" The blood drained from Arabella's face. "I do not know what you are talking about." "I think you do. I think you know exactly where she is hiding. And I think you know that the man who helped you hide her is not who he claims to be." "Oh, come now, Miss Fairfax. Did you really think I would not investigate? Did you really think I would not learn that the man who interrupted our garden assignation was none other than the Duke of Thornwood himself?" Blackwood's smile was triumphant now, vindictive. "The silent Duke, they call him. The man who watches from shadows. Did he tell you that, when he was playing at being a humble Mr. Ashworth? Did he tell you that he has been watching you curtsy to the wrong man and saying nothing?" The world seemed to tilt beneath Arabella's feet. The Duke of Thornwood. Mr. Ashworth. The same man. She had curtsied to Lord Blackwood, believing him to be the Duke. And the real Duke, Sebastian Ashworth, the Duke of Thornwood, had watched from the shadows and said nothing. "I see you are beginning to understand," Blackwood said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "He has been deceiving you from the beginning, Miss Fairfax. playing games with your reputation, your trust, your heart. Whatever he has told you, whatever feelings you have developed for your mysterious protector, they are all built on lies. Why are you telling me this? Because I want you to know what kind of man you have been trusting. Because I want you to understand that he is not your friend, not your savior, not whatever romantic hero you have imagined him to be. Blackwood leaned closer, his breath hot on her ear. And because I want you to know that if you do not return your sister to her family immediately, I will make certain that everyone in London learns how the Duke of Thornwood has been hiding a runaway in one of his own properties. The scandal will destroy him, and you and your precious sister will be returned to your parents regardless. You cannot. I can, and I will. He stepped back, his charming mask sliding back into place. You have until tomorrow evening to make your decision. Return your sister, and all of this goes away. Refuse, and I promise you will regret it for the rest of your life. He bowed mockingly and walked away, leaving Arabella standing alone in the midst of the glittering crowd, her entire world collapsing around her. She found a quiet corner and sent a note to the Thornwood townhouse to the Duke, she now understood, not to any friend or distant relation. The note contained only 3 words. Garden. 1 hour. Mr. Ashworth. No, the Duke of Thornwood was waiting when she arrived at the garden behind the Westmore townhouse, hidden in the shadows as he always was. She walked toward him with steps that felt heavy, weighted down by the knowledge she now carried. Miss Fairfax. He moved toward her, and even in the dim light she could see the concern on his face. Your note was I came as quickly as... You are the Duke of Thornwood. The words fell between them like stones into still water. She watched his expression shift surprise, followed by something that looked like resignation, followed by a pain so raw she almost looked away. Yes, he said finally, I am. You watched me curtsy to Lord Blackwood believing he was you. You watched me walk into a garden with a predator while you stood in the shadows and said nothing. Yes. You have been lying to me from the beginning. Every conversation, every moment of supposed honesty, all of it built on deception. Not all of it. His voice was rough. The things I told you about myself, about wanting to be known, about hiding behind walls, about fearing what I might become, those were true. Everything I felt when I was with you was true. But you never told me who you actually were. No, I did not. She waited for him to explain, to defend himself, to offer some justification that would make the betrayal easier to bear. But he simply stood there, accepting her anger like penance he believed he deserved. Why? She demanded finally. Why the deception? Why let me believe you were someone else? Because I was a coward. He spoke the words quietly, without self-pity. Because when you curtsied to Blackwood and called him your grace, I saw something I had never seen before, a woman who did not know she was speaking to a fortune. A woman who might actually see me rather than my title. And I wanted that. I wanted it so desperately that I convinced myself the deception was strategy when it was really selfishness. You used me. Yes. I told myself I was protecting you, but I was also using you. Using your trust, your openness, your willingness to see beyond surfaces. He took a step toward her, then stopped, as though afraid she would flee. And I will spend the rest of my life regretting it, whether you forgive me or not. Lord Blackwood knows, she said flatly. He knows who you are, he knows about Catherine, he knows about the safe house. He has threatened to expose everything unless I return my sister to my parents by tomorrow evening. The Duke's face went hard in a way she had not seen before, not the controlled severity she had grown accustomed to, but something colder and more dangerous. Blackwood will not expose anything, he said. I have been gathering evidence of his crimes for months. Evidence of the women he has ruined, the families he has destroyed, the laws he has broken in pursuit of fortune. If he attempts to use what he knows against you or your sister, I will destroy him utterly. And if you expose him, he will tell everyone that the Duke of Thornwood watched me curtsy to an impostor and said nothing. He will tell everyone that you let me believe a lie. The scandal. I do not care about the scandal. You should. Your reputation. My reputation means nothing if I cannot protect the people I... He stopped, swallowed, forced himself to continue. The people I care about. Arabella stared at him. This man she had trusted. This man who had deceived her. This man who somehow managed to be both things at once. She wanted to hate him for the lies. She wanted to forgive him for the truths he had hidden inside them. She wanted to understand how someone could be so calculating and so vulnerable, so controlled and so clearly, desperately in need of connection. "I need time," she said finally. "Time to think, to sort through what I feel, to decide what to do about Catherine." Of course. He did not try to stop her, did not reach for her, did not make any move that might be interpreted as pressure. "Take whatever time you need. Whatever you decide about Blackwood, about your sister, about me, I will accept it. I will help you regardless, if you will allow me to help. I owe you that much at least." She turned to leave, then stopped, looking back at him over her shoulder. "The things you told me," she said, "about wanting to be known, about hiding behind walls, were those true?" "Every word." "Then I will think about that," she said, "when I am deciding whether to forgive you." She walked away into the darkness, leaving him standing alone in the garden, the Duke of Thornwood, watching from the shadows as he always did, saying nothing as she disappeared from view. But this time she knew his silence was not strategy or deception. This time his silence was simply the sound of a man who had finally run out of masks to hide behind. Arabella did not sleep that night. She lay in her narrow bed at her aunt's house, staring at the ceiling while the candle burned down to a stub and shadows crept across the walls. Her mind replayed every conversation she had shared with the man she had known as Mr. Ashworth, every moment of connection, every glimpse of vulnerability, every word that had made her feel seen for the first time in her life. All of it built on lies. And yet... She remembered the way he had looked at her in Lady Hartley's garden, when he had asked her what she truly wanted. The roughness in his voice when he had admitted that safety and loneliness might not be so different. The pain in his eyes tonight when she had confronted him with the truth, a pain so raw and genuine that it could not have been performed. He had deceived her about his identity. But had he deceived her about himself? The distinction mattered, she realized. It mattered enormously. Because the man she had been falling in love with, the one who watched from shadows and protected the vulnerable and spoke of wanting to be known that man existed, he was real. He simply happened to also be a duke, burdened with a title and a fortune and a reputation he had never asked for. She thought about what he had told her of his motivations. "I have spent my life watching people be destroyed by those with more power than they possess." That was not the statement of a man who enjoyed his position. That was the confession of someone who understood exactly how much damage power could do, and who had chosen to use his own power as a shield rather than a weapon. He had been wrong to deceive her. Terribly, painfully wrong. But she was beginning to understand why he had done it, and understanding was the first step towards something that might, eventually, become forgiveness. The question of what to do about Lord Blackwood was more complicated. His threat hung over her like a sword: return Catherine to their parents, or watch as scandal destroyed everyone she cared about. The Duke had promised to expose Blackwood's crimes if necessary, but that exposure would come at a cost. The story of the mistaken curtsy would become fodder for every gossip in London. The Duke of Thornwood's reputation would be shredded, and Arabella herself would be painted as either a fool who could not recognize an impostor, or a schemer who had knowingly participated in the deception. None of which mattered as much as Catherine. Her sister was the innocent in all of this, a 16-year-old girl who had done nothing wrong except refuse to be sold to a monster. Whatever happened to Arabella, whatever happened to the Duke, Catherine deserved protection. Catherine deserved a future that did not include Mr. Thornbury's cold hands and cruel reputation. By the time dawn began to lighten the sky, Arabella had made her decision. She would go to the Duke to Sebastian, she corrected herself, because that was his name, and she might as well begin using it, and she would ask for his help. Not because she had forgiven him, not because she trusted him completely, but because he had resources she lacked, and because, despite everything, she believed he would use those resources to protect her sister. And then, depending on how the conversation went, she might begin the slow and painful process of deciding what she felt for the man behind the mask. The Thornwood townhouse on Berkeley Square was larger than Arabella had expected a grand Georgian structure that spoke of generations of wealth and power. She stood on the pavement outside it for several minutes, gathering her courage, before finally climbing the steps and raising the knocker. The butler who answered was exactly the sort of butler such a house should have, elderly, dignified, possessed of an expression that suggested he had seen everything and been impressed by none of it. "Miss Arabella Fairfax to see His Grace the Duke of Thornwood," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I do not have an appointment, but I believe he will see me." The butler's expression flickered almost imperceptibly. "Miss Fairfax, of course. His Grace left instructions that you were to be admitted immediately should you call. Please come in." Left instructions, which meant he had anticipated that she might come, had hoped she would come, had prepared for the possibility, even as he gave her space to decide on her own terms. The butler led her through a magnificent entrance hall and up a sweeping staircase to a private study on the first floor. The room was lined with books, thousands of them, filling shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling and furnished with the kind of comfortable, worn pieces that suggested actual use rather than mere display. A fire crackled in the grate, despite the mild weather, and the light from tall windows illuminated motes of dust floating in the air like tiny stars. Sebastian stood by one of those windows, looking out at the square below. He turned when she entered, and she saw the evidence of a sleepless night written plainly on his face, shadows under his grey eyes, a tension in his jaw that spoke of long hours spent wrestling with thoughts he could not escape. "Miss Fairfax." He did not move toward her, did not presume any familiarity that she had not offered. "I was not certain you would come." "Neither was I." She remained near the door, maintaining distance between them. "I spent the night thinking about what you told me, about the lies, and about the truths hidden inside them." "And what conclusions did you reach?" "That you were wrong to deceive me, that the deception was selfish and cowardly, as you yourself admitted, that I have every right to be angry and hurt and uncertain whether I can ever trust you again." He nodded, accepting the judgment without protest. "Yes, all of that is true. But I also concluded that the man I was coming to know, the one who spoke of wanting to be known, who protected women from predators, who helped my sister without hesitation when I asked that man was not a performance. He exists. He is standing in front of me now." Something shifted in Sebastian's expression, a flicker of hope, quickly suppressed. "He does. He is." "I have not forgiven you," Arabella said clearly. "I am not certain I can forgive you yet. But I am willing to try, if you are willing to give me the truth from this moment forward. All of it. No more shadows, no more masks, no more watching in silence when you should be speaking. I will tell you anything you want to know. Ask me whatever you wish." She moved further into the room, settling into one of the worn leather chairs by the fire. After a moment's hesitation, Sebastian took the chair across from her, and they sat facing each other like negotiators at a peace conference. "Tell me about your father," she said. "You mentioned once that you feared what you might become." "I want to understand what you meant." The question clearly caught him off guard. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze dropping to the fire. "My father was the 6th Duke of Thornwood," he said finally. "He was charming, passionate, and utterly without moral restraint. He destroyed everything he touched: his estate, his family, his dependents, and eventually himself. He died in a duel when I was 24, fighting over a mistress who meant nothing to him, leaving behind debts that took me years to untangle, and a reputation so foul that I have spent my entire adult life trying to live it down. You believe you might become like him? I know I carry his blood, his capacity for passion, for obsession, for wanting things so intensely that nothing else matters." Sebastian's hands tightened on the arms of his chair. "I have spent years learning to control that intensity, to watch rather than act, to protect from the shadows rather than risk the destruction that comes when I step into the light. And is that why you deceived me? Because you were afraid of what might happen if you let yourself want something openly?" "Yes." The word came out rough, almost painful. "When I watched you at the Hartwell ball, watched you help that frightened girl, watched you laugh when you thought no one was looking, watched you struggle against the mask your aunt wanted you to wear, I felt something I had not felt in years, something I had convinced myself I could not afford to feel." "What?" "Hope." He met her eyes finally, and what she saw in them made her breath catch. "Hope that perhaps someone could know me, truly know me, all of me, the darkness as well as the light, and not look away. And that hope frightened me so much that I chose deception over honesty, chose the safety of shadows over the risk of revelation." Arabella absorbed this, turning it over in her mind. "And now? Are you still frightened?" "Terrified," he admitted. "But I am more frightened of losing you than I am of letting you see me. That, I think, is what has changed." They sat in silence for a moment, the fire crackling between them. Then Arabella spoke again. "Lord Blackwood's ultimatum expires this evening. I need to know what will happen if I refuse to return my sister." Sebastian's expression hardened. "Then I will expose him. I have evidence of every crime he has committed for the past 5 years, every woman he has ruined, every family he has defrauded, every law he has broken. I have been building this case in secret, waiting for the right moment to deploy it. If he forces my hand, that moment is now." "And the scandal, the story of the mistaken curtsy, will become public, yes." He did not flinch from her gaze. "The ton will learn that the Duke of Thornwood watched you curtsy to an impostor and said nothing. They will call me cold, calculating, perhaps even cruel. They will wonder what game I was playing with an innocent young woman's reputation. And what will you say in your defense?" "The truth." His voice was quiet but certain. "That I saw you, and wanted you to see me, not my title, not my fortune, but me. That I made a selfish choice in a moment of weakness, and that I have spent every moment since then trying to earn the trust I did not deserve. That I love you, Arabella Fairfax, and that love has made me both better and worse than I ever knew I could be." The words hung in the air between them the first time either of them had spoken of love directly, the first acknowledgement that what existed between them was more than circumstance or attraction or mutual convenience. "You love me," Arabella repeated slowly. "I do. I have no right to, given how I have behaved. But I do, and I cannot pretend otherwise. And if I cannot love you back, if the deception is too great a barrier for me to overcome—" Something flickered across his face: pain, yes, but also acceptance. Then I will help you and your sister regardless. I will destroy Blackwood because he deserves to be destroyed. I will protect Catherine because she deserves protection, and I will spend the rest of my life proving that I can be trusted, even if I must prove it from a distance, even if you never let me close again." It was not a conditional offer. There were no strings attached, no demands for reciprocation. He was simply telling her what he would do, whether she loved him or not, because it was the right thing to do, and because he loved her. Arabella felt something shift inside her chest, some wall crumbling, some barrier dissolving. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the recognition that forgiveness might someday be possible. That this man, for all his flaws and fears and terrible choices, was trying to become something better, and that she could choose to be part of that transformation if she dared. "I cannot say I love you," she said carefully. "Not yet. There is too much I'm still sorting through. Too much hurt that needs time to heal." "I understand. But I can say that I want to. I can say that when I think about the future, my future, whatever it holds, you are part of what I imagine. Not because you are a duke, not because you have resources I lack, but because you see me, the real me. And I think I might be beginning to see the real you as well." Sebastian closed his eyes briefly, and she saw his shoulders release tension she had not realized they were holding. "That is more than I deserve," he said, "and more than I dared hope for." "Then let us deal with Lord Blackwood," Arabella said, rising from her chair with newfound resolve. "And after that is done, we can begin the slow and difficult work of building something on truth instead of shadows." The destruction of Lord Reginald Blackwood was swift, thorough, and remarkably satisfying. Sebastian had spent years preparing for this moment, gathering evidence from sources Blackwood never suspected, building a case that would withstand any challenge. When he presented his documentation to the appropriate authorities, and, just as importantly, to the appropriate influential members of society, the response was immediate and devastating. 3 of Blackwood's previous victims came forward with their own testimonies, emboldened by the knowledge that they would finally be believed. A 4th sent a letter from the remote estate where she had been living in shame, detailing her experience in terms that made even hardened society matrons weep with sympathy. Financial records revealed a pattern of fraud that extended back nearly a decade. And 2 very nervous gentlemen who had served as Blackwood's accomplices proved remarkably eager to cooperate in exchange for leniency. Within 72 hours of Sebastian's initial exposure, Lord Reginald Blackwood had been formally charged with fraud, attempted extortion, and conduct unbecoming a gentleman. His assets were frozen, his reputation was destroyed, and he was strongly encouraged to leave England before additional charges could be brought. He left on a ship bound for the continent, never to return. The scandal of the mistaken Curtsied did emerge, as Sebastian had predicted, though in a form rather different than Blackwood had intended. The story that circulated through drawing rooms and ballrooms was not one of a cold duke playing games with an innocent woman, but of a dedicated protector who had temporarily assumed a false identity in order to catch a dangerous predator. Sebastian had been investigating Blackwood for years, the whispers said. He had used the opportunity of the Hartwell ball to observe his quarry without detection. Miss Fairfax had been an unfortunate bystander who had been drawn into the Duke's operation, and he had protected her admirably once he realized she was at risk. It was not entirely true, of course, but it was true enough, and it painted both Sebastian and Arabella in a far more flattering light than the alternative. "You managed that rather skillfully," Arabella observed, reading the latest society column in her aunt's morning room. "I am portrayed as a romantic heroine caught up in intrigue, rather than a desperate fortune hunter who curtsied to the wrong man." "I may have made some suggestions to certain influential gossips," Sebastian admitted. He had taken to calling on her openly now, presenting himself as a suitor in the conventional fashion. Lady Whitmore was beside herself with joy at the development, though she was still somewhat puzzled by how it had all come about. "I thought you might prefer that version of events. I appreciate the consideration, though I cannot help noticing that your own role has been rather elevated as well. The silent duke who brought a predator to justice has a much nicer ring than the strange man who watched from shadows and lied about his identity." "I have no idea what you mean." She set down the paper and regarded him with the direct gaze he had come to know and love. "Catherine's situation. Have you had word from your solicitors?" "I have." His expression sobered. "Your parents have agreed to relinquish guardianship in exchange for the settlement of your father's debts, all of which, you will be pleased to know, are now paid in full. Catherine will become my legal ward until she comes of age, at which point she will receive a dowry sufficient to secure her future on her own terms. You did not need to do that. Pay the debts, I mean. It was not your obligation. Your family's debts were what drove you to desperation in the first place, what drove Catherine to flee rather than face the monster your father had promised her to." Sebastian's jaw tightened. "Removing that pressure seemed like the least I could do. You have given me my sister's safety, my family's financial security, and my own freedom from the marriage market. I am not certain how I am supposed to respond to such generosity. You are not supposed to respond in any particular way. These are not gifts with strings attached. They are simply the right things to do." Arabella studied him for a long moment, this man who had deceived her and protected her, who had hidden in shadows and stepped into the light, who loved her without conditions and asked nothing in return. "Sebastian," she said, and it was the first time she had used his Christian name. He went very still. "Yes? I think I'm ready." "Ready for what?" "To try." She rose from her chair and crossed to where he stood by the window, close enough to touch him if she chose to. "To try loving you, to try trusting you, to try building something together, with all our flaws and fears and terrible past choices laid bare between us." "Arabella." He breathed her name like a prayer. "You do not need to. I know I do not need to. I want to." She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the severe line of his jaw. "You asked me once what I wanted for myself. I said I wanted to be known, to be seen, to have someone look at all of me and not look away." She held his grey gaze, letting him see everything she felt. "You have done that. Despite the lies, despite the shadows, you have seen me more clearly than anyone ever has, and I find that I cannot imagine a future without you in it." "I have so many flaws," he said roughly, "so many ways I might fail you." "I know. I have flaws too. I am too sharp-tongued, too opinionated, too much of everything. But perhaps—" She smiled, and it felt like sunrise after a long dark night. "Perhaps we might be too much together." He kissed her then, finally, properly, not a calculated move or a strategic gesture, but the honest expression of a heart that had spent too long in hiding. She kissed him back with equal honesty, equal intensity, and when they finally broke apart, they were both breathless and trembling, and more certain than they had ever been of anything. "I will spend my life earning your trust," he said against her hair, "every day, in every way I can. I know you will, and I will spend my life proving that your trust in me was not misplaced." She pulled back to look at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "We have both been so afraid of being seen, of being known and found wanting." "But I think perhaps the real danger was never in being seen. It was in spending our whole lives hiding." "No more hiding," he agreed. "No more shadows. Just us, stepping into the light together." "Together," she repeated, and the word felt like a vow. They were married 6 weeks later, in a small ceremony at the chapel on Sebastian's country estate. Only family and close friends attended Lady Whitmore, still somewhat bewildered by the speed of events. Catherine, radiant with happiness for her sister. A handful of Sebastian's trusted associates who had helped him in his long campaign against Blackwood. Arabella wore a dress of ivory silk that had cost more than her father's annual income had been before his debts were settled. She had protested the expense, but Sebastian had insisted, and she had discovered that arguing with a duke who loved you was rather pointless when he set his mind to something. The ceremony itself was brief and traditional, but when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Sebastian's kiss was anything but traditional. It was thorough and possessive and unambiguous, the kiss of a man who had spent years watching from shadows and was finally claiming what he wanted in full view of everyone. "That was rather scandalous," Arabella murmured when they finally broke apart. "I find I no longer care about scandal. The silent duke, openly demonstrating passion? Society will be shocked. Society can manage its own affairs. I have more important things to concern myself with." "Such as?" He leaned close to whisper in her ear. And whatever he said made her blush crimson and laugh in a way that made several of the elderly relatives present fan themselves vigorously. The years that followed were not without challenges. Sebastian still struggled sometimes with the legacy of his father, with the fear that his capacity for intensity would curdle into something dark. Arabella still struggled sometimes with the conviction that she was too much, that even a man who loved her completely might eventually tire of her sharp tongue and strong opinions. But they struggled together, which made all the difference. They learned to speak their fears aloud instead of hiding them. They learned to trust that love could survive conflict, that disagreement did not mean disaster, that two flawed people could build something beautiful if they were willing to do the work. Catherine flourished under their protection, eventually choosing to marry a young scholar who adored her intelligence and never once made her feel like property to be traded. She remained close to her sister throughout her life, and her children called Arabella and Sebastian aunt and uncle with easy affection. The safe house that had sheltered Catherine became the first of many such refuges, part of a network Sebastian established to protect women fleeing dangerous situations. Arabella took an active role in managing this network, using her sharp mind and sharper tongue to advocate for those who had no voice of their own. The silent duke, society eventually learned, had not been watching from shadows out of coldness, but out of purpose, and his duchess was every bit as formidable as her reputation suggested. They had 3 children, a son who inherited Sebastian's grey eyes and Arabella's copper hair, and twin daughters who combined the worst and best qualities of both parents in ways that kept the household in constant entertaining chaos. The Ton learned to expect the unexpected from the Duke and Duchess of Thornwood. They hosted balls where wallflowers were actively sought out and made to feel welcome. They sponsored artists and writers and thinkers who challenged conventional wisdom. They danced together at every event they attended, and their obvious delight in each other's company became something of a legend. "They say he watched her curtsy to the wrong man," younger society members would whisper to each other. "And then he spent the rest of his life making certain she knew exactly who he was." On an evening in early summer, 7 years after the Hartwell ball that had brought them together, Sebastian and Arabella hosted their own annual celebration. Thornwood Manor was ablaze with light, the gardens filled with guests, the ballroom alive with music and laughter. Their son, William, was 5 years old and meant to be in bed. Their daughters, Rose and Clara, were 3 and equally meant to be asleep. Instead, all 3 children had snuck down from the nursery and were hiding behind a curtain near the ballroom entrance, watching the dancers with wide, wondering eyes. Sebastian found them there, having slipped away from a tedious conversation with a cabinet minister to ensure the children had not gotten into any of their more creative forms of mischief. "You are supposed to be sleeping," he said quietly, crouching down to their level. "We wanted to see Mamma in her pretty dress," Rose explained with the confident logic of a 3-year-old, who had never yet met an argument she could not win. "And the dancing," Clara added. "Dancing is splendid." "Is it indeed?" Sebastian looked at his children, these small, perfect people who had somehow emerged from his love for their mother, and felt his heart expand in ways he would not have believed possible when he was a young man convinced that the Ashworth capacity for passion would only lead to destruction. "Tell us a story, Papa," William demanded, "about how you met Mamma." "It is rather a long story." "We are rather patient," his son replied, and Sebastian had to hide a smile at the echo of Arabella's wit in the boy's words. "Very well." He settled onto the floor beside them, his back against the wall. His expensive evening clothes be damned. Once upon a time, there was a duke who spent his life watching from shadows. He believed that staying hidden was the same thing as staying safe. He believed that his heart was too dangerous to share with anyone. "That sounds sad," Rose observed. It was, very sad. But the Duke did not know he was sad, because he had forgotten what happiness felt like. Sebastian glanced toward the ballroom, where he could see Arabella dancing with her elderly uncle, her copper hair brilliant in the candlelight. And then one night, at a grand ball much like this one, a young woman with hair like fire and a laugh like music curtsied to the wrong man. She thought she was meeting a duke, but she was actually meeting a villain. "A villain?" Clara's eyes went wide. "What happened?" The real duke watched from the shadows, as he always did, and he said nothing, because he was too afraid of what might happen if he stepped into the light. But eventually he found his courage. He saved the young woman from the villain, and he began to fall in love with her, even though he knew he did not deserve her. "Did she fall in love with him too?" William asked. "Not at first. First she had to learn the truth about who he was. First she had to decide whether his mistakes were too great to forgive. First she had to be very brave, because loving someone means trusting them with your heart, and that is always frightening." "What happened then?" "Then—" Sebastian paused, watching his wife turn on the dance floor, her smile bright and unguarded. "Then she chose to love him anyway, despite his flaws, despite his fears, despite all the ways he had failed her. She chose him, and he spent the rest of his life trying to be worthy of that choice." "Is the story over?" Rose asked, sounding disappointed. "No," Sebastian said softly. "No, I do not think it will ever be over. I think it will keep going, getting better and richer and more beautiful, for as long as they are together." "I like that story," Clara declared, "even though it does not have dragons. Next time I will add dragons, I promise." Arabella appeared at the curtain then, her cheeks flushed from dancing, her eyes warm with love and amusement at finding her husband and children huddled together on the floor. "I wondered where you had gone," she said. "I might have known I would find you in the shadows." "Old habits." He rose to his feet, brushing off his trousers. "I was telling them how we met. The real version, or the version appropriate for children? A version with the truth hidden inside it," he admitted. "I thought I might save the full story for when they are older." Arabella knelt down to gather her protesting children into her arms. "Time for bed, my darlings. You have stayed up far past your bedtime already." "But the dancing will still be happening the next time we have a ball, and you will be allowed to attend properly when you are older." She kissed each of them in turn, then handed them off to the waiting nursemaid, who had appeared with an expression of weary tolerance. "Go on now. We will come up to say good night in a little while." The children were led away, still protesting, and Sebastian and Arabella stood alone in the quiet space behind the curtain. The music continued in the ballroom beyond, but here they had a moment of privacy, a breath of stillness in the midst of celebration. "You looked happy," Sebastian said. "Dancing?" "I was happy. I am happy." She moved closer to him, her hand coming up to rest on his chest. 7 years ago tonight, I curtsied to the wrong man in Lady Hartwell's ballroom. It was the most humiliating moment of my life. And somehow it led to this, to you, to our children, to a life I never dared imagine. I watched from the shadows that night, he said, and I said nothing, because I was afraid. I have always been afraid, Arabella, of wanting too much, of loving too intensely, of becoming the thing I feared. And now? Now I am still afraid sometimes, but I have learned that fear is not a reason to hide. It is a reason to be brave. He cupped her face in his hands, tilting it up so she could see his eyes. You taught me that. You, who were always too much for everyone else, who were exactly right for me. Sebastian? Her voice was soft with love. Dance with me. We have danced already tonight. Then dance with me again. Not out there, where everyone can see. Here, in the shadows, where it is just us. He pulled her close, and they swayed together in the narrow space behind the curtain, moving to music that filtered through the fabric like light through water. It was not a proper dance. There was no room for proper dancing, but it was theirs, and that made it perfect. I love you, he said against her hair. I have loved you since the moment I saw you help a frightened girl with a torn hem. I have loved you through lies and truth, through fear and courage, through every moment of the last 7 years, and I will love you for the rest of my life, in shadows and in light, in public and in private, with everything I am and everything I have. I know, she said. I love you too. The man who watched from the shadows, the man who stepped into the light. All of you, Sebastian. Every part. They stayed there a moment longer, wrapped in each other's arms, hidden from the world by nothing more than a velvet curtain. Two people who had spent their lives believing they were too much, finally finding someone who wanted everything they had to give. Then Sebastian stepped back, offering his hand with formal courtesy. One more dance, he said. In the light this time. Arabella smiled the brilliant, unguarded smile that had captured his heart 7 years ago and held it captive ever since. In the light, she agreed, and she took his hand, and they stepped out of the shadows together, into the warmth and brightness of the ballroom, into the gaze of everyone who had gathered to celebrate with them, into a future that stretched ahead full of promise and possibility. The orchestra began a new waltz as they reached the dance floor. Sebastian drew his wife into his arms, and they moved together with the easy grace of two people who knew each other completely, every flaw, every fear, every fierce capacity for love. Around them, guests whispered and smiled, the way they always did when the Duke and Duchess of Thornwood danced. It had become something of a legend. After all, the way the silent Duke who never danced had learned to waltz for his copper-haired wife, the way they looked at each other as though the rest of the world had ceased to exist. But Sebastian and Arabella did not notice the whispers. They did not notice the smiles or the curious gazes or the romantic sighs of young ladies who hoped someday to find a love like theirs. They only noticed each other, her hand in his arm around her waist, the music carrying them forward into whatever came next. And when the waltz ended and the applause began, they did not step apart immediately. Instead, they stood together at the center of the ballroom, holding each other close, letting the world see what they had found. A love built on truth, forged in forgiveness, strong enough to step out of any shadow.